Now, Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
Rhode Island isn't exactly batting 1,000 as a venture capitalist, with a loan guarantee to Capco Steel running into problems and 38 studios leaving the state on the hook for $75 million. Some say the state would be better off giving smaller amounts to lots of firms, spreading out risk and raising the odds of success. They may not know Rhode Island already does that through a little-known program called the Slater Technology Fund, created 15 years ago by Governor Lincoln Almond. Its latest investment, $250,000 for a startup in Charlestown that wants to change how power gets delivered. This week on Executive Suite, Slater Technology Fund Managing Director Thorne Sparkman and VoltServer CEO Steve Eaves. Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. With me this morning, I want to thank them for being here, Thorne Sparkman and Steve Eaves. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So let's just start with the basics, like I like to with this kind of thing. I mentioned at the top the Slater Technology Fund. Thorne, you're the managing director. What is the Slater Technology Fund?
Yeah, the Slater Technology Fund is a seed investment fund that invests in technologies in life sciences, in software, and in energy. So we're the first investors after you've got some money maybe from your friends and family. We're the people that come in and are the first institutional investors in your startup company.
So you do the due diligence on the firms. Do you get applications?
That's right. So probably 200 different people call me in a given year and say, you know, here's what we think is the next best thing. So I'm the person who sifts through that and figures out what's the best and makes investments.
Now, people might have a little memory at home of, I think originally when Lincoln Almond had the idea and the General Assembly passed in '97, there were multiple Slater funds or something like that. Could you sort of explain how it got to where it is now?
That's right. Well, it started off, the model started off with some people in called the Rhode Island Center for Cellular Medicine, and they made some small grants to professors in the life sciences space. So they basically tried to clone out that idea. Okay, if it works in life sciences, let's try it in software, let's try it in other sectors. And they hired a guy to do each one of those, and ultimately they kind of mashed them all together.
And now it's one thing, and you're looking at all of them.
That's right. There are two of us, and I invest in software and energy.
Now, how much a year do you have to invest, and where does the money come from?
We get about $3 million a year from the state of Rhode Island, and we've recently got some money from federal government sources as well. We invest about $2 million into companies like Steve's every year.
And how much risk is there? I mean, I mentioned 38 studios at the top. I'd imagine you're hearing about it all the time. These are, it should be clear, much smaller investments. I think $250 is the biggest single investment you make, although sometimes you'll add more for a few companies, right?
Right. $250,000 is a typical first investment, sometimes smaller, sometimes bigger. We'll put up to $1 million into a company that's tracking over time and hitting all their milestones and raising money from others.
Now, I want to get a better sense of the process. I'll bring Steve. I'll bring you in a minute. But how do you decide? You know, you said you get 200 calls a year. That's a lot of people.
Sure.
I'm sure they all think they have a great idea.
They all do.
So how do you vet them? How do you decide what's and how do you hopefully be a good steward of that money you're trusted with?
Sure. Well, I've spent 15 years investing in software and internet technologies, so I have a pretty good gut sense when I talk with someone. Have they been successful in the past? So the first cut is with me typically. After that, if I want to go deeper, there's a whole network of people I can call depending on what sector the person is investing in. So I've got a network of people that might be in healthcare IT, or in storage, or in internet technologies, or in energy. So I'll make a few quick calls to see, is this something the world wants and needs? Are this guy's claims valid, and is this person really at the top of his game? If it gets beyond that stage, I bring in a bunch of advisors in that sector. I have standing advisory boards that are full of people who have been successful entrepreneurs and investors in those specific fields. So we bring them in. There may be 10 or 12 of them to look at 2 deals. And if they make it through that gauntlet, then there's a much deeper stage of legal diligence, and finally an investment committee decision, and then a deal takes place if possible. So it's multi-stages, and it could fall out of the process anywhere along the way.
And it's pretty similar to how other venture capitalists work in terms of looking at a firm, right?
I'd say so. You know, the partner plays a large role in it, and he relies on a network of smart people around him.
Any companies we'd recognize that you've invested in?
Sure. We were the first institutional investors in Andera, which employs 90 people here.
Charlie Kroll's company. People
Charlie, right.
Yep.
Yeah, he's the CEO.
Steve, let's turn to you now. We'll talk about VoltServer, your new firm, in a bit, but I want to start by getting your sense of the value of Slater. Obviously, I assume you're fans since they're helping to get you going with this, and they've helped before, but especially after 38 Studios, I've had a lot of people say to me, taxpayer money should never be used to pick winners and losers. That's what's always said. What do you say to those critics, admittedly as someone who's been picked?
Well, you know, as a Rhode Island resident, I find it hard to imagine that Rhode Islanders don't want the state to invest in technology. You know, it's the sort of seed that brings jobs that can support the American family today. I mean, you need jobs in engineering, technology, you know, electronics technicians, assemblers, all that type of work creates value in the state. It's not just about revenue, but it's about providing an income to people where they can live a decent state of life.
And where does Slater matter for your company, for example? I mean, how important is it to have this, and what role does it play?
It fits this space. You know, as a Rhode Island business, like everybody else, I compete for investment. You know, to start a company, you need an idea, but then you need to combine that with talent and investment. And myself, when I start a company, I'm competing with people around me. Here it's mostly Boston. And you know, if you look at the amount of money that's spent in venture capital, it starts with California, right around Stanford, where most of it is.
Yeah.
You know, and then you come over to Route 128, that's the second place, and then there's New York, which gets a little bit more, and then the rest of the world gets whatever's left. You know, Rhode Island doesn't even register on the map in terms of venture capital investment. And the Slater gives me a little edge as a business in Rhode Island to compete, you know, in that space. You know, so when I go up to Boston, I'm like everybody else up there coming out of MIT, you know, these guys that have great ideas but also great connections in that market. And so Slater lets me get a little bit of an edge in exchange for having employees in the state. And it's something, because I like the state, it's something I can work with well.
And Thorne, same thing. I'm sure the winners and losers, you've surely heard it too, all since Slater's been around, but especially in the last couple months where there's been so much discussion about the state as a venture capitalist. What do you say to people when you hear that? Well,
the state created the Slater Fund in order to outsource that skill. So, you know, we're the people who've created that mechanism. There are venture capitalists and entrepreneurs in the room all the time when we're looking at these deals. So can the state make investments like that? Sure. They use the standard venture capital playbook, and they get people like me and my advisors to do the best we can and pick the winners.
And is EDC involved in the Slater Fund at all, the Economic Development Corporation?
The money comes through the Economic Development Corporation, but we don't deal with them on a day-to-day basis.
It's right. It's really its own nonprofit.
That's right. It's its own corporation.
All right. Well, we have to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how Steve Eaves' new company wants to change how we manage electrical power. So stick with us to hear about that. You're watching Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Our guests this week are Thorne Sparkman, Managing Director of the Slater Technology Fund, and Steve Eaves, Founder and CEO of VoltServer, a startup in Charlestown, and that's where I want to go next. I was reading about it. Slater invested $250,000 in VoltServer, announced July 23rd. Described in that statement as an innovative way to manage and deliver electrical power. The idea won Innovation of the Year from Providence Business News last year, my old stomping grounds at PBN. And I liked a quote you had, Thorne, which called VoltServer's idea a radically different approach to a ubiquitous industrial challenge, which is a nice set of words there. So how would you explain this to a 10-year-old? What are you trying to do with VoltServer? What's the idea?
Well, I guess I would relate it back to things like video and music. All those things have gone from what we call an analog format to a digital format. and ones and zeros in the digital format. And but electrical power is essentially the same as it was in the 1800s. You know, it flows out of the wall like a continuous stream of water, let's say. And what our technology does is it breaks that up into a bunch of tiny little segments of energy. And each segment has an identifier, a digital identifier, that lets you track it. And so if you touch a device that is covered by this packet energy transfer technology, your body will not respond to the transmission device and give it the right code back. And the system will recognize that you're not a valid recipient of energy, and it will stop or redirect the power somewhere else.
Where'd you get the idea?
It started from my last business, Modular Energy Devices, was a lithium-ion battery business, and we were approaching the electric vehicle market with batteries. And you know, a battery is very difficult to cost effectively put in a vehicle and have it go a long distance. So if we could just figure out a way to power the vehicles from the road surface, say just on the highway, then you would only need a battery to power whatever's left, you know, and you can get a huge coverage of range by having that ability. So I was looking for a way to safely transfer energy from a road surface to a vehicle, and that's how it started. Right now we're approaching sort of closer markets in order to show revenue to our investors, so we're starting out with telecommunication markets first.
What do you want to sell them? What would it look like? Would it be like a box or something?
Yeah, it's a box. If you look at like a cell tower, you know, some of them are pretty high, 200 or 300 feet high, and they have to route that power up to the antennas at very low voltage because of safety restrictions. So packet energy transfer lets them increase that voltage, which makes the wire smaller. So they can take, you know, what right now is maybe 12 to 1,300 pounds of copper and reduce it to 10 to 15 pounds of copper using packet energy transfer.
Now, I mentioned before Thorn, this isn't the first time Slater invested with Steve. You mentioned Modular Energy Devices. Slater was a key backer for that company, which was sold last year to Enersys, a bigger firm. But I want to know, with this one, you know, we were talking about your process before. What did you hear in the idea behind VoltServe? You said this is a good place to try Slater investment.
Well, number one, I've known Steve for a decade. I've watched him work. I've watched him build companies.
So is it crony capitalism then?
Crony capitalism. Well, the greatest asset an investor could possibly have is a network of experienced entrepreneurs. So if what you mean is, did I invest in someone whose capabilities I know? Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And but so we don't play golf together.
You don't golf together. That's good to know. Well, maybe if it gets really big, you'll have to golf. So what did you hear in the idea, the product, the innovation here that you said, that's interesting, that's the market might want that and we want to be involved? Sure.
Well, energy encompasses some of the great problems of our time. So I've spent the last 5 years exploring some of those problems. Big problems demand big solutions. So I've been looking into the area. Just the combination of the transmission of power and the intelligence that software brings to it, right away the DNA is correct. As Steve mentioned, power is being transmitted the same way it was during when Edison built the first grid in lower Manhattan. So it was ripe for change. Energy's powerful. Energy is dangerous, and whenever you project energy, there are safety precautions all around it, whether it's a speed limit or regulations about how to wire something. So when an experienced engineer comes to me, combining technologies from two different spheres in something that's horizontally applicable, addressing some of the world's biggest challenges, you know, you sit up and take notice.
And not the first time with energy. I think Greenbytes got a Slater investment too, which is a company, is that correct, first of all? Am I right about that?
No.
Wow, all wrong. Well, that's what happens when you tape the show live, folks. Steve, I was reading, Michael Grunwald has a new book out about the stimulus, and one of the things he mentions that I didn't know much about is how much that turbocharged the battery industry in a lot of ways. It created a lot of investing there that hadn't been there before. As someone in that industry and who was, you know, has a company Joe sold, what did you see in recent years in the battery industry? We talked about it just last week with the company with the Mars rover.
In terms of technology or the stimulus program?
What's changing? Yeah, what did the stimulus do, and sort of how is the battery industry changing?
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not a real proponent of the results of the stimulus package. You know, I think sometimes that type of investment was about people in the government, you know, deciding, you know, what the future was. You know, and that happens to some extent, but you can't be so detailed about it. You can decide what area of technology looks good. You know, you could decide certain metrics about how small a battery should be or how light it should be. But to pick what area to go in, what happens is you get a cat and mouse game where the businesses start following the money,
as opposed to following
the market. Yeah,
where the market's taking them. But we're coming up on a break. But Thorne, we're taping this on a Wednesday. Just this morning, you announced an additional investment in MoFuse. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, MoFuse helps businesses design websites that work really well on the cell phone. And I don't know about you, but I spend more time with my phone than I do with my family these days. And MoFuse recognized early that real estate between a consumer's eyes and their cell phone is absolutely critical. So they've made an interesting bet on the tools to help make that interaction better.
And that's a company that's been around for a little while now, and you're seeing success. It's growing.
It's doing well. The Slater Fund was the first investor in that company as well, and now we're joined by a couple other angel networks, and yeah, things are going great.
Terrific. All right. Well, we have to take another break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what lessons Rhode Island can take more broadly from Slater experience. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Our guest this week, Thorne Sparkman, Managing Director of the Slater Technology Fund, and Steve Eaves, Founder and CEO of Volt. Volt Server, among other companies based down in Charlestown. So I wanted to talk some more broadly about the business environment here. I was talking to a tech entrepreneur recently, and you alluded to this too, Steve, earlier, and he said one of the problems in Rhode Island is just a lack of venture capital. Just there aren't a lot of venture capitalists out there. There's not a big amount of money available. I mean, is that something you hear frequently, and is that part of why Slater plays a key role?
Well, it's always hard to raise money, and it's especially hard to raise that first money. I think that we're 40 miles from the second biggest pot of venture capital in the world. So if as an entrepreneur you do your job well and put together a great team, the money will find you. The question is, are we doing a good job of putting together those kind of those starting teams and seeding them with that critical first $1 million that can help them access the capital that's up?
And I noticed with the MoFuse investment today, I think it mentions that you partnered with other venture firms. It's not just your money that you're putting in; others are putting in money as well.
Right. So Slater is almost always the first money into a company, but you never want to be the only investor for long, right? If other investors aren't coming in with you or aren't looking to invest, that's a danger sign. So in the case of MoFuse, a bunch of other investors have seen the same promise we do and have joined us in there.
Steve, your thoughts on that question of what's available venture capital for Rhode Islanders?
I think Thorne is right. You know, he's talking about the initial seed capital in the first stage. You know, when you get some traction, you know, our objectives on this seed round is to get the product in the hands of the customers, get it tested and evaluated so that the customers accept it, and then you sort of have something strong, you know, and then you have a competitive package, and you equip that with a team too, and then you can go up to Boston. But it's difficult if you're looking for money here in Rhode Island, you know, compared to, you know, Route 128 or, you know, California. It's just a different story. I mean, you have to compete with those guys that are up there creating companies that came out of MIT or Stanford, and, you know, it's a difficult environment for anybody, you know, especially at Rhode Island. I think Slater's critical for that initial kick that you need to get going and get that traction.
So you see a clear difference. It was interesting from what you were talking about before with the stimulus, where the government was sort of pushing the industry in a direction, versus something like Slater, which does have a connection to the taxpayer in terms of the funding, but it's not that same push of where industry is going to go.
No, because Slater follows, they follow a VC model. Their methodology is a VC model. You know, even the thing Thorne was talking about people that you know, a good VC or a good angel investor is recycling deals that were successful. You know, they call that quality deal flow. They have people that they know that can show traction. You know, and they use the due diligence that Slater does is very classic to the VC industry. So it's not operating. It's operating like a private entity, it is being channeled with state and federal funds, but it's not. Slater isn't dictating where the entrepreneur goes. They just give them the stuff they need to get going.
And how involved is Slater now that Slater's an investor? You know, are they telling you, all right, you're going to do this with the the technology?
No, I mean, I talk to Thorne quite often, you know, because now Thorne is a key investor, and so is the state, you know, so that you know, my responsibility as a CEO is to maximize the benefit to my investors, you know, so I talk to Thorne quite often, but Thorne doesn't dictate where the business is going, and Thorne doesn't want to. He's got other deals, you know. The whole idea is to get you what you need so that you can exist on your own.
And we've got to talk about, we brought it up before, 38 Studios, sort of the elephant in the room in this kind of discussion at this point. Big discussions happening about the state's involvement in economic development, period. What did you make? I mean, obviously Slater doesn't have the resources if it wanted to put $75 million into 38 Studios, but what did you make of the structure of that deal and the way it unraveled?
Yeah, well, you know, investing in startups is a risky business, and some are going to make it and some aren't. So the real question is, if you know your business is risky, how do you go about mitigating that risk? And at the Slater Fund, we have, you know, we follow a portfolio strategy, so we know that we're going to place 10 bets, and 3 or 4 of them may not reach their potential, but the other part will. So diversification is a first lesson. We have specific amounts of money that we invest and specific hallmarks that we expect to see before we reinvest. You asked before about co-investment, and that's one of them. You know, if there aren't co-investors alongside us, something may be wrong. So you have to create a system where you're doubting your own thoughts, where you're poking holes in your own theories, and create a process and people around you that can keep you from making bad decisions.
I have to say that, I mean, you also have observation rights at Volt Server, so the Slater has a position. It's not an actual board seat, but it's where you have the right to come in and observe the board actions.
Yeah, that was one of the surprising things I saw. They had a lot of ability to say, no, you can't see this, you can't be involved in this part of what we're doing, et cetera, and that's not the case with this.
No, this is the start of a process that Steve and I have been through before, but you know, I'm on the board of 5 or 6 of the portfolio companies, and I'm an observer on 4 or 5 of the others, and Steve and I right now are developing the business plan and numbers that we're going to follow on a monthly basis. So we'll know mutually immediately if the venture gets off track.
Just about 30 seconds left, Steve, but what's next? Now that you have the investment, what are you doing next at Volt Server?
We're going to get it in customers' hands and go after revenue. I mean, that's what's next. You know, telecommunications first, and then the power grid and transportation after that.
All right, that's all the time we have this week. We'll be keeping track of Volt Server. I want to thank my guests, Thorne Sparkman, Managing Director of the Slater Technology Fund, and Steve Eaves, Founder and CEO of Volt Server, as well as Modular Energy Devices and other companies. And I want to thank you for tuning in here on MyRI TV. Stick with us every week on Executive Suite. You can watch it if you miss the show on WPRI.com. We'll see you next week here on MyRI TV.